Jai Baba. This is the 9th session in our series, God Speaks as the Master Framework for Meher Baba's Darshana. This will be continuing from last time, where we began to talk about the path, the involutionary path, or the inward spiritual journey. I've divided the greater topic into 8 parts, as I'm calling it. It's the 9th session, but the 5th part. We're right now in the 5th of 8 subdivisions, or parts, as I'm calling it, of this series. It's the 9th session, but the 5th subdivision. And let me read from the slide what the topic has been last time and this time. The Involution of Consciousness. The middle chapters of God Speaks describe the involutionary journey of ascent from ordinary gross conscious man state to the realization of God from different angles of vision. Part 5, that's chapter 5, provides a basic account of the 7 planes, and that was the last session where we went over that. Part 6 describes the states of higher consciousness, and part 7 explains the structure of the veil, V-E-I-L, veil. The involutionary journey concludes and culminates in the realization of God, which represents the completion and consummation of the divine theme. Now, as I've been saying in recent sessions, throughout this whole series from the beginning, God Speaks is based on the divine theme, which is so nicely illustrated in this chart by Rano Gailey, which we keep recurring to. The divine theme, again, is a journey of the soul from the original beyond state of God up here at the top, through the evolutionary series, through different kingdoms of evolution, from stone through animal, until you arrive at the human form, where you go through the long reincarnationary cycle of 84 lakhs of rebirths, 8,400,000 rebirths. You enter into the spiritual path at the end of that cycle, and first experience the subtle sphere and then the mental sphere. The subtle sphere is the circle in green here, and the mental, the circle in blue. There are 6 planes distributed through these 2 spheres. And at the summit of the mental sphere, the third eye opens. In the physical body, it corresponds to that point. And you see God face to face. And the journey is completed when, by the grace of the Sadguru, you realize God and have the I am God experience. That's the story of the divine theme. So last week, we were talking about these 6 planes as illustrated in Rano Gailey, one of Baba's disciples. She did this chart for Baba. So these are the 6 planes which we were describing last time. Now, here is what Baba is doing at this point in the book. And here's the table of contents. You can see these parts on the left. It means chapters. So there are 10 chapters. Last time we dealt with part 5, the planes. Now, what Baba does in the 6th and 7th chapters is that he goes through this involutionary journey 2 more times. It's like little epicycles, and he does it each time from a different angle of vision. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Those 2 chapters where he again reviews involution, but with quite a different focus than he did the first time. Okay, I'm switching slideshows, so this could be a little break here. Okay, let me just scroll through a bit of these 2 chapters so that you can see them. This is part 6, means chapter 6. Summary of the states of divine consciousness. As you can see, it's about 10 pages long. And then part 7 is called the sevenfold veil. It's quite esoteric and strange, as we'll see when we get there. Now, Baba has provided a vocabulary for people who are located at different parts of the spiritual path. He had been doing this since the 1920s, but in God Speaks, he really gave it a more definite form. These are some of the terms that will come up. He would talk about yogis, sadhaks, and raravs. Those yogi is, of course, Hindu term, and rarav would be an Islamic Sufi term. He used this in reference to spiritual pilgrims on the lower planes of consciousness, like 1 through 3. A Mahatma would be someone on the 3rd plane. A Mahayogi, someone on the 4th plane, where you get God's own infinite powers. A Mahapurush would be someone on the 5th plane. A Wali would be the Islamic term for that, a Sant. He has other words for it. And a Satpurush would be someone on the 6th plane of consciousness, and the Sufi term would be a pir. Now, for people who are God-realized, and there are different types of these, and Baba will start to explain it now in this chapter. But some of the terms are a Brahmi Bhut. This is someone who realizes God but is completely unconscious of the universe. The Islamic term would be a Majub. And I won't go over all these others in detail, except for Sadguru, a perfect master, who is God-realized, fully conscious of the universe, and has duty to perform in the universe. And the avatar is a separate case of God directly descending every 7 to 1400 years. Buddha, Jesus, Baba said Muhammad, avatar. Baba said he was the avatar himself. Krishna, Ram, Zoroaster were the ones he typically named. Now, this chart here is a useful one if you want to look at some of these names. We'll go over this chart more fully later on, but you can see in the center, or on the slightly to the right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These would be the 6 planes of consciousness, right? And this would be Anubhuvam, that's the gross sphere, the Pranabhuvam, the subtle sphere, and Manobhuvan, mental sphere. So the involutionary path is going right up through all those planes to God realization. And here on the left, he gives a bunch of these terms for some of these types of people located on these different paths. On the right, there are all these correlating terms. I'll just show you that it's there between what he calls Vedantic, mystic, and Sufi terms, so that the languages are being correlated. That's an important part of what God Speaks does. Now, in the beginning of this part 6, Baba starts with a review of the progression that takes us to human form in the first place. And I said before, and I keep noticing, one of the characteristics of God Speaks specifically is when Baba is at a point that he wants to begin analyzing, consistently he'll go back and do a review of how we got there. That's true of God Speaks in particular, and not of his other books. So he does that here, and the point he wants to make in the beginning is that the human form is the perfect form, and to achieve it, you need to have full, gross physical consciousness. So the entire involutionary journey from, all these, stone, plant, worm, fish, bird, we've been all of those things. And that was all to achieve full, complete, gross consciousness. And it's actually a great accomplishment to arrive in the human form, which is the perfect form. It's the end of evolution. Nothing more is beyond that. But the problem is, as he explains, that once you achieve the human form, you're a slave to the sanskaras, or impressions, that got you there. You got this consciousness by accumulating more and more and more and more sanskaras, impressions of experiences. And that's how your consciousness grows. But now that you're a human being, you think you're a monkey, because that was your last lifetime. So you live like a monkey. You don't at all use it to find God. And thus you're trapped in this reincarnationary cycle, lifetime after lifetime, because you haven't the slightest idea what the purpose of life is. Even though it all originated in that primal question, who am I? That God asked himself, which means which every one of us asks that question. And that's actually what we're seeking. And the only answer is, I am God. But at this point, you're so benighted with your monkey impressions that you haven't the slightest idea of this. Okay, so Baba reviews some of this in the beginning of this chapter. But then gradually, at a certain point, you start to... your gross impressions disappear, and in their place you come into the view of subtle sanskaras from the subtle domain, the domain of pran, or energy. And people who advance beyond that stage, those subtle impressions are burnt away. You destroy them through the process of the spiritual path. And then mental impressions of thoughts and feelings come into your domain of experience. And when finally those are gone, you realize God. It's a long journey. At the beginning of this section, this paragraph here, I'll read a little bit from this. He says, eventually, one of two things happens. The Atma's gross sanskaras may entirely disappear all of a sudden, and the Atma lose consciousness of the gross body and gain consciousness of the self, thus losing experience of the gross world and gaining experience of Paramatma. And the reason I'm reading that is it's a very odd sentence. Baba never explains it. But apparently there are some people who just all of a sudden lose their sanskaras and realize God. He says this in one other place and never explains it. But the more usual process is you have to go through this long business of getting rid of gross sanskaras and coming into subtle sanskaras through mental sanskaras. Only when all impressions and sanskaras are gone, down to the very last one, can you realize God. That's why you really do need the help of a master. But once you have realized God, then now this is new content for God Speaks, and it's going to be important. Baba says you come into possession of one of three states. And when I listen to various people talking from Vedanta and other spiritual paths, I find a lot of confusion about this. There are actually different kinds of experiences that are there. And there are basically three of them. And so these are they. The first one has state A and state B, even though they're essentially the same thing. So in state A, in state A, soon after this experience of the highest of the high, that is the I am God state, Aham Brahmasmi, or Anal-Haq, as Al-Halaj said, the Atma generally drops all of its shadowy bodies, gross, subtle, and mental. That is, our bodies are shadows. We dealt with this in an earlier session. They're shadows of the Atma. They're not real at all. It drops them and eternally enjoys individualized experience as a whole, the infinite power, knowledge, and bliss in God, without using the attributes thereof. Okay, so you just you die. Because you're not even conscious of your body anymore, and it matters to you not at all. It does not even exist for you. But the second B part of this, the Atma may not drop these three bodies until some time afterwards, although it is absolutely unconscious of these bodies. Except that it retains the bodies, its state is actually the same as A. So from the standpoint of the Shivatma, the God-realized individuality concerned, whether you have a body or whether you don't is something you're completely unconscious of. But to others, there's a lot of difference. You may see someone who, there are these characters. Brahmi Bhut is a term Baba uses for it, and Majub. I don't have it here, but there's some pictures of Majubs. And you can really see it. This guy, he is conscious. There's no doubt about that. But he ain't conscious of us. The world does not exist for a Majub. Okay, so this is the first fundamental state. So for most people, once they leave this universe, they're gone. They never come back because it doesn't really exist. And why should they come back? For most people, that's the destiny. But here's the second state. The Atma retains the three bodies and simultaneously with self-consciousness is also conscious of its three shadows, gross, subtle, and mental bodies, right? These are shadows of the Atma, or of the soul. And at the same time, it experiences the infinite power, knowledge, and bliss of God. That's the triune nature of God. Power, knowledge, bliss. It also experiences the gross world, the subtle world, and the mental world as God's shadows. We saw earlier the three bodies are the shadows of the Atma, and the three worlds or spheres are the shadows of Paramatma. The gross world, like this physical world that many of us experience, it's the third shadow of the Paramatma. But it does not use the power, knowledge, and bliss of God for other Atmas, who are mental conscious, subtle conscious, and gross conscious, and so it is independent. Baba's term for these souls there are two categories, Paramhansas and Jivatmas. And they're conscious of the universe, all spheres. They have infinite knowledge of God, but they don't do anything. Or if you went to them, they might help you a little bit, but they don't have duty fundamentally. They observe. But the third state this is exactly like the second state, except that the Atma uses its infinite power, knowledge, and bliss in making gross conscious Atmas subtle conscious, right, from the gross sphere to subtle sphere, big advancement, and subtle conscious Atmas mental conscious, and mental conscious Atmas self-conscious, and even at one stroke, making gross conscious Atmas self-conscious, a perfect master. These are Sadgurus or the avatar, perfect masters. Kutub is the Islamic term Baba used for this. These are some of the famous masters, like Ramakrishna Paramhansa was this, or Kalkat Swami, have you heard of him? He was one, or Sai Baba Shirdi, he was, or Upasani Maharaj, or Jalaluddin Rumi, he's become famous, St. Francis of Assisi. Some of these great personalities were perfect masters. So from the standpoint of people in creation, like most of us, there is a huge difference between these three types, because the third type helps. They really help. Whereas the first type, a Majub, you do benefit from being in the presence of a Majub, but he doesn't even know you're there. But the atmosphere helps you. But the ones who really help humanity are of this third category. So here is a chart that we'll be getting to in a later session. This is the chart called the 10 States of God. And let's see if I can expand it. Well, I sort of can. It kind of doesn't fully work. Let me shrink again. You see this? This is a Roman numeral 8. These are people like Majubs or Brahmi Bhuts who are conscious of the I am God state and completely unconscious of the universe. It does not exist for them because it does not really exist at all. They realize the truth of things. This ninth state of God, the divine junction, Baba calls it, is for those souls who are conscious of the universe. They're fully conscious of everything, the three spheres, but they have no duty. And the 10th state of God, this one here, is for Sadgurus, perfect masters, or the avatar, who are conscious of the universe and have duty therein, and perform immense service for everyone, give a spiritual push to the entire universe, and also have a circle and a larger circle of devotees for whom they give special personal assistance. Those are the basic types of God-realized souls. And this is the first chapter in which Baba has really explained that point. Okay, here are some other... Baba starts to get into some other topics here. And here, I'll show where I've summarized it. He develops this big analogy, and I'll just summarize it and not go into it very much, but to illustrate what the three spheres and Paramatma beyond it are like. He compares God or Paramatma to the sun. And he really emphasizes it's not our physical sun. There's no special importance to our physical sun. It's just an analogy. He harps on that a lot. But to be on the gross conscious individual is like being right here on the earth plane. To be a subtle conscious individual is like being up in the air, able to fly in the atmosphere. To be a mental conscious person, these are saints, genuine saints, walis or Mahapurush or like that, is like being in outer space very close to the sun. And although Baba doesn't use the word here, it makes me think of the Hindu concept of the Trilok, which does have these, one of its meanings is earth, atmosphere, and sky. So it makes me think of that. It's like Baba is using that as an analogy for the same thing. That's one of the metaphors that he develops a lot in this 6th chapter. But then the other principal topic that really comes up in chapter 6, part 6, is a huge warning about the 4th plane of consciousness. On the 4th plane of consciousness, you come into the divine powers of God. The first 3 planes, you get little powers. You can make trees bloom or fill up. Actually, we could use a 2nd plane, or they can fill up dry wells with water. We could use a little bit of that at the moment. Or stop trains or things like that. And on the 3rd plane, you can make the blind see, or you can walk on water, all that kind of thing. By the way, Jesus did miracles, but he was actually God himself. He descended to the 4th plane to do these miracles. On the 4th plane, you have divine powers. One of them, you can raise dead people, like Jesus did for Lazarus. Or Baba said you can create whole worlds teeming with life. There are stories in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana that make me think of this. There's Viswamitra in an early stage of his career in the Ramayana. Seems like he was tempted to exhibit 4th plane powers. Later, he seems to become a perfect master, as I can see it. But the danger there is if you misuse these powers, these divine powers on the 4th plane of consciousness, you suffer a cataclysmic fall. It's the one true spiritual disaster anywhere in the spiritual journey. Anywhere else, if you fall, you'll come back up again. Once you get to be a human being, you really can't go, you fall below human form again. Your consciousness is only the human form is adapted to the consciousness you have. But if you abuse your powers on the 4th plane, there's like a short circuit, and there's a tremendous clash of powers, and you fall all the way back to stone state. The stone state of consciousness, if you can imagine that. It takes billions of years to come all the way from stone through metal, through plant, through worm, through fish, through bird, to human being. Millions and billions of years. You have to do it all over again. So it is a unmitigated disaster, and it's in consequence of abusing powers of the fourth plane. So this chapter really harps on that. Baba really warned about using powers of any sort, but it's at this stage. And what makes the fourth plane of consciousness particularly dangerous is that you're right at the juncture between the subtle sphere, or the sphere of pran, and the mental sphere, which is where thoughts and feelings and desires are. And you're getting a tremendous surge of desires, and you're not in control of them yet. When you get into the fifth or sixth plane, you become a master of thoughts and feelings, and you can govern them. But on the fourth plane, you have their full force, and you're not in control of them at all. So you have all these desires. You want to show off how great you are. Maybe there's even lust there, or power, or all these sort of selfish human desires, and you want to do it. You just absolutely want to do it. And if you do, it's catastrophic. So this is the real danger point on the spiritual path.
Can I ask one question? So this is the only point where a soul can drop back to the stone age?
Yeah, Samat Naman is saying, is this the only place from which you can fall back to the stone state? Yes, it is. That's it. The earlier planes, Baba does explain in Creation as Causes, you can have a temporary slide back to a lower plane. But it's only in the fourth plane that you come into the powers of God. These are actually the powers of God. Now, Jesus used these, but Jesus was actually God conscious. And he had to descend to the fourth plane to do these miracles, because that's where those powers are. So when he, raised the dead or did things like that, the joke is, Baba said, people belittle Jesus who attribute his greatness to doing miracles, which a fourth plane yogi can do. All kinds of people can do these things. Jesus was much greater than that. If they think that proves his greatness, they're belittling him. So he had to descend. Baba actually said Jesus did miracles so as to provoke the people in that situation to crucify him, because that he needed to do that for his work.
So, as we take the birth in a human form, a human being can never go back to any other form. The consciousness evolves.
Yeah, the human being can never slide back to lower forms, no. Now that seems to be an important clarification that Baba gave, because it seems like in most Hindu and Buddhist culture, the idea is there that you can go back to lower forms. But Baba explained that that really doesn't happen. And the reason is that you've got full developed consciousness when you arrive at the human form. And the human form is the only vehicle adequate for that. So, you really can't go back. It's not, you've outgrown it. Even if you've been very bad. Even a very bad person. If you're very bad, you suffer, under the law of karma, but you do so as a human being. The human form, once achieved, is never lost, except for the fourth plane.
Only the greatest sin is to abuse the powers.
To abuse powers, occult powers, is the one real disaster. So Meher Baba would always discourage people from getting into the occult and getting into the use of these powers, because it's a terrible habit, If you develop a taste for it, then when you get to the fourth plane, you want to do it, and then you invite disaster. Now, if you're on the fourth plane and you resist the tremendous flood of desires and you don't use your powers at all, you eventually get through. This is called the dark night of the soul. Baba said that phrase relates to the fourth plane. You go to the fifth plane, and then there's no possibility of a fall. You're a master of it at that point. But if you use powers well, you can get lifted directly to the sixth plane. And there are certain people on the fourth plane who are, the Islamic term is an abdal. They're agents who are used by the hierarchy to do certain tasks. And Baba gives this as an example. Let's suppose There's a spiritual seeker in the deserts who's dying of thirst. A fourth planer could appear, give some water, and disappear again. That would be an example of good use. Good use would not be healing someone's sickness. That would actually be bad use, because people are sick because of the law of karma, and meddling with that does not help them, and it's inviting trouble. So it's, our ideas of good and bad are not adequate to this. So Baba has a very highly developed metaphor that he uses here in this chapter, and this is the last topic I'll be bringing up, of a scientist. He wrote God Speaks in the 1950s, and just a few years earlier they had set off, dropped atom bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So he was using the analogy of a nuclear bomb. And he said, let us suppose this is a gross plane. A nuclear scientist is not on the subtle planes. They're gross conscious. But nonetheless, he was using this as an analogy. Let's suppose you have a scientist who's invented a great new nuclear bomb, more powerful than the latest hydrogen bomb. And he just wants to set it off. He's craving to use it. He's invented this thing and wants to use his power. All these desires are flooding upon him to use it. Well, if he can't control himself, and let's suppose he sets it off. And Baba gave this as an analogy. He's so aghast at what he has done that he collapses on the ground. And when he wakes up again, he's suffered from complete amnesia. You know amnesia? He's forgotten everything. He doesn't know his own name. He doesn't know that he's a scientist. He doesn't know how to speak. And he has to start over again from the standpoint of knowing absolutely nothing. This is an analogy for what happens on the fourth plane. You lose all that you knew and you go back. In his case, he's still human conscious, but actually you go all the way back to stone state, like an electron, the very beginning of the spiritual journey. And has to come all the way up again. I won't take the time here, but in the latter pages of God Speaks, Baba, in the supplement, Baba gives a lot more information about some of these occult powers. What are the powers of a perfect master or avatar who will do universal work? What are the powers of... By the way, on the fifth and sixth plane, Baba said, you can't do miracles. You're above it. Of course, you can get someone else to do it. It's sort of like you're a big boss and you don't know how to use the software, but you've got underlings you can order. So you can get a fourth planer to do it. But you don't do it yourself. You've gone beyond the stage where you can. They're the divine powers of the fourth plane. There are small occult powers of the first through third planes. And Baba also said there are these small minor occult powers, tantric powers, of people who are not on the planes at all, who can do certain things like levitate or other things like that. Again, you're asking for trouble when you do this. But Baba did say that if you have minor occult powers and use them well, you'll get major occult powers in your next lifetime. And if you use them well, you'll get to the fifth plane in 3 lifetimes. So apparently there are, but some of these tantrics, a lot of people who would call themselves that are just plain frauds. But there is the real thing. And these can be people who are not even on the spiritual path, but have cultivated these kinds of powers. Anyway, you can find a discussion of this in the supplement. Now, this is chapter 7, the sevenfold veil. And I'm going to just not say much about the opening, but I will say this. It's very different from every other chapter in God Speaks. The tone of it is different. Let me just read the beginning and you'll see what I mean. It's very informal. Kabir was a perfect master as well as a poet. Kabir Wani, his book of poems, is therefore the more unique because of his lucid expositions on God, love for God, and the divine path and illusory creation, etc. It's like Baba is being very chatty all of a sudden. It's the only place in God Speaks where he does that. He goes on in the next paragraph again to give more warnings about miracles. He gives the story of a perfect master was sitting by a river and waiting for the ferryman. And a yogi comes and sees him and just walks across the water and comes back and says, well, that was a little easier than what you're doing, isn't it? And the perfect master says, yes, and it wasn't worth as much as the fee for the ferryman, 1 anna. It wasn't even worth that much. It's worth nothing at all. So again, Baba is saying these miracles are worthless, completely worthless. Baba keeps harping that people attach all this importance to them, but they have no importance at all. And then Baba does talk a bit about the establishment of the conquering, on this page I'm looking at here, page 68, conquering desires and the awakening of divine love. So one of the things that strikes me about this chapter is it's about the only part of God Speaks where Baba talks about love. He talked about love everywhere with his devotees, but not in God Speaks. But there is a bit about it here. But then he gets to the real main subject, which is over on this page 69, which is the veil, V-E-I-L. Do you know the word of veil? The one of the Islamic words would be hijab, or how do you say, gungat? Gungat, yeah. He uses both of those words. I think Kabir uses the word gungat and Hafez uses the word hijab. And it'd be the same idea, a burqa, if you've really got a big-time veil. Someone like me, I've got a burqa. I'm really veiled. A burqa and a hijab too, plus a gungat, all three. So the veil is what keeps you in ignorance and from seeing God. This is a standard metaphor very much in Sufi Islamic poetry and mysticism, but in Hindu mysticism also. But here Baba gives a real further articulation of it. And it's something quite different from the rest of God Speaks. And I'll only be able to say there are actually many, many connections that could be drawn here, but this veil has a structure, which is this. It has 7 folds, like a piece of cloth. I don't have a piece of cloth here, but you can, like folds on a curtain, like that. 7 folds, 7, and each is tied with a knot, and each has a color, and each has a world of impressions associated with it, sanskaras, and each is associated with an opening in the face, actually. The human face turns out to be deeply significant. And when you go through the spiritual path, gradually you loosen the folds of the veil and get rid of the deep dark colors and impressions, and you pass through the openings in the face one at a time. Like when you enter into the first plane, you go in through the mouth. And when you go to the second plane, you go in through the right nostril. I think in a lot of yoga traditions, they do a lot with the nostrils. And water, yeah. Baba did say, by the way, that on the inner planes, we have 5 gross senses, but on the inner planes, you have just 3, smelling, hearing, and seeing. And so once you've gone in through the mouth, well, I guess your taste is gone. You're now experiencing subtle senses. They're something quite different. But anyway, the third plane, you go in through the left nostril. To the fourth plane, you go in through both ears. You enter in through them. And to go to the fifth plane, you enter in through both eyes. Now, this image comes to mind with all this movie technology. I don't know if you've ever seen one of these movies where all of a sudden an actor starts to go through all this, some sort of a terrible contortion, and his face twists, and it goes inside out. If you can imagine, your face turning the other way, right? It seems like something like that happens because gross conscious people are looking out, right? Through our senses. I'm looking out right now through my eyes. I'm hearing, I'm smelling, tasting, all of that. Well, you have to actually turn around and look in. So apparently that coincides with this process of entering in through the openings of the face. And this correlates with all these operations with the veil. So here are a few little passages about it. The gungat literally means the covering that a woman extends over her head and face in a number of folds. In spiritual parlance, it represents the heavy folds of ignorance that keep man hidden from his real identity. The lifting of it, fold by fold, corresponds to the stage-by-stage journey of a pilgrim from the first through the fifth plane. So you go through these, I'll read in the next paragraph too. The veil that separates a man in ignorance from God, who is all knowledge, is so subtle that even the highest and finest thought cannot pierce through it. When you get up to the sixth plane, there is no more thought. Sri Aurobindo Gosei was on the sixth plane. And when you're on that plane, there are no thoughts left. Even though to others you seem to be expressing thoughts, but you've actually gone beyond it. This veil consists of 7 folds of seven different deep colors. Each fold is tied with a separate knot. Thus, there are 7 knots to the 7 folds. The 7 colors represent the 7 root desires, corresponding to the 7 fundamental impressions, i.e., lust, greed, anger, etc. Kam, Krodh, Lobe, there are these lists of them, you get in people like Kabir. Connected with the 7 openings of sensation in the face, viz., mouth, right nostril, right ear, right eye, left eye. So when you go to the first plane, here's how he describes it. Okay, when an initiate succeeds in actually entering the divine path, it is for him a single 7-in-1 achievement, and it applies to the first of the 7 folds of the veil, right? So going to the first plane, you're dealing with just the first fold. 7-in-1 achievement, which is this: 1, unfastening of the first knot. 2, disappearance of the first fold. If you imagine a curtain, the fold disappears. 3, crushing out of the first root desires, say lust or whatever it might be. 4, wiping out of the relative fundamental impressions. That would be sanskaras. You have to annihilate the sanskaras. 5, doing away with the first of the 7 deep dark colors. 6, entrance through the first door, represented by the mouth. You have to go in through the mouth, whatever on earth that means. And 7, arriving on the first plane of the subtle sphere, the Pran Bhuvan, or the Alam-e-Malakut. Alam-e-Malakut would be the Islamic Sufi term for the subtle sphere. So in dealing with the first fold, there's the 7-in-1 achievement. And this has to be done for each of the planes. Actually, for the 4th plane, it's 2-in-1. You have to do with both ears. And for the 5th plane, it's 2-in-1. You have to do it through both eyes. Again, to reiterate this point, what comes to my mind is like the outer face turns and your inner face starts to look at God. And to do that, it's like turning the eyeballs, you know. You have to go in through these sense openings, and you start to use your inner subtle senses. When you reach the fifth plane, so the fourth plane is that terrible point of danger, right? When you reach the fifth plane, all the folds are gone, the colors are gone, all of that's finished, but the veil is still in place. So you don't see God, actually. When you go from the fifth to the sixth plane, the veil lifts, and you see God face to face. You see God everywhere and in everything. It's an overpowering. I would imagine Moses, you know, on Mount Sinai. Maybe that's a description of a sixth plane experience. Or, you know, there are a lot of saints here in India who are on that level. But you still, even though the veil is gone, you experience yourself as separate from God. And it's the agony and the ecstasy of love is experienced there. You feel ecstasy at the sight of God and agony at the impossible distance. It's like you're separated by this vast, illimitable canyon that is uncrossable. It's so huge. But you see God and long for God. Some of Baba's dealings with musts, six-plane musts, illustrate the ironies of this. They longed for Baba, but were terrified of him at the same time. Because when you unite God with God, you're losing yourself. It's not just dropping your physical body. It's much more traumatic than that. You, yourself, are gone. That false separative ego. So there was a six-plane must in one of Baba's must ashrams, and one of Baba's mandali, Kaka, was responsible. And in the middle of the night, Kaka woke up and saw this must going out of the building. So Kaka followed him, and the must was really irritated, and he pretended he was just going to the bathroom and came back in, and he said, "You're very thorough, Kaka." I mean, he wanted to head for the hills. He wanted to run away because he was terrified of having that final experience. So this is Baba's account of this, and there isn't time to go into it now, but Baba has said various other things to indicate that the human form is deeply significant. There's a whole branch of study, it's called subtle physiology among the scholars of this subject. You have versions of it in yoga, you have versions of it in Taoism, where the human form maps onto some kind of great cosmology, macrocosm cosmology, where it's deeply significant. And Baba clearly indicated that this was true. In fact, in this very chapter, just before this, I skipped over it, but I'll read it now. God is a macrocosm, God is a microcosm, and God is also always beyond both. Knowingly, man is body and man is mind, but unknowingly, as in deep sleep, man is also beyond both. Analogically, it is true that man is made in the image of God. The top of his head, this part here, the crown of the head, represents the Vidyan Bhumika. Are you acquainted with that term? I think Hiranyagarbha, sometimes they'll use that term in relation to it, or the Islamic term, the Arsh-e-Allah, the throne of God, the highest spiritual state, or the seat of Brahman. The forehead corresponds to the entrance to divinity. That's right here. The center of the forehead, just above the two external eyes, is the seat of the third or inner eye, and so forth. So like a majub, someone who realizes God but is unconscious of the universe, corresponds to this part of the body. A Sadguru is actually located there because they go up and down. Like the fifth plane is here, and so forth. In fact, Baba did say once that the entire inner bodies, the subtle and mental actually, correspond to the human form from the neck up. And the human body from the neck down represents the gross. And there are 7 openings in the face, which, as we've seen, correspond to the 7 planes. But there are also 7 parts of the lower part of the body, the 2 feet and our legs, the 2 hands, the trunk, the anus, and the genitals. And those also have a symbolic significance. So there's much more to be said about this. The human body is deeply, profoundly significant. It's the perfect form. Okay, and the very last thing I'll say, you can see this is a very interesting and unusual and rich chapter. And there are many other things in Baba's other books that would relate to it if we wanted to spend more time. But Baba brings up one other topic, quite different from this, that I want to mention, that you might not be so aware of. There's a branch of philosophy called Epistemology. That is the study of how you know. Now, Meher Baba was decidedly not a philosopher, and he usually didn't give attention to this, but it's one of the big branches of philosophy. In the Indian darshanas, they called the pramanas, what are the bases for knowledge? Perception, sabda, which is a verbal testimony from the Vedas, say, or various ways that you can know things. Well, here is one of the places where Baba does actually address this. And what he focuses, the word he uses is the word you can see on this page 73, is a Islamic word, yaqeen, which is certainty. And what Baba is talking about here is not ordinary knowledge. Baba certainly had a place for ordinary knowledge. When he did his work with the musts, his disciples would have to go out and find out where the musts were through ordinary means, by asking people, by looking, by getting maps. Baba worked normally as a man on the physical plane. But spiritual knowledge is based on direct certainties. And here he gives a number of these. The first of these mentioned on this page is, this is all Sufi language. Ilm, Sufism, the Islamic mysticism. Ilm ul yaqeen, or intellectual conviction. That's what can be gained by people on the gross plane, where you are intellectually, absolutely convinced of God's existence. I kind of feel as though I have that, to tell the truth. I do feel completely convinced of it. So I don't know if it's the real thing or not, but I do feel that way. But when you get onto the plane, there are these 3 higher levels. Conviction by intuitive perception, yaqeen ul yaqeen. Conviction by sight, ayn ul yaqeen. And conviction by actual experience, haq ul yaqeen. Haq means truth. Truth with a capital T, like Sat of Satchidanand. It's like that. So the first of these, yaqeen ul yaqeen, is the kind of conviction you get when you're on the planes. When you're on the planes, you have direct experience of inner realities. You see light. You can do miracles. You see thoughts if you're on the 5th plane, like that. Baba gave this funny analogy in the 1920s. He said, let's suppose you're going into Ahmednagar. This is back in the 1920s. It was a little town then. And you smell Ganga, like marijuana. Well, you know as an absolute certainty that Ganga is there, but you don't actually see it. So that's that's like the experience on the planes of consciousness. You know that God is there, but you don't actually see God. The second one, Ainul Yaqeen, you see God directly, and you have the certainty of knowledge. There can be no doubt about it. I skipped the passage, but earlier on, Baba does say, our experience of the physical world is like a dull shadow compared to the experience of the inner planes. People on those planes know what they're experiencing with much greater certainty than we do. They know that we're seeing shadows. But when you actually experience God, That is the certainty of certainties. And that's this third one here, Hakol Yakin. And this is epitomized in those great sayings like Aham Brahmasmi is from the Barhadaranyakad Upanishad, a great saying, one of the Mahavakyas. Or Anil Haq is the saying of Mansur al-Hallaj, the got him crucified for heresy in Baghdad in 922. That's the state, with absolute certainty of the I am God state. So that is a very brief summary of these two chapters. And now after this, we're going to be we've completed the first pass through the divine theme in God Speaks with this. And we're going to be dealing with chapter 8, which is very long. It's like 80 pages long. And it goes through the divine theme a second time from a completely different point of view. I'm going to approach this very differently than we've done so far. I'm going to be dealing with some of the great, I won't be going through it page by page or anything like that. It's too long and it's too difficult. But instead, I'll be talking about some of the great principles of cosmic architecture, like God as knowledge, power, bliss, or God as creator, preserver, destroyer, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, or the three states of sound, sleep, dream, wakefulness, the everything and the nothing, themes of that kind. So the next 3 sessions will be devoted to chapter 8. It's a very difficult chapter, there's no doubt about it. It's the hardest part of God Speaks, but there's a lot there. So from next week, we'll be doing a deep dive into chapter 8. So that's all for today. Avatar Meher Baba Ki Jai.